Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending my presentation today. It is an absolute honor and privilege to be in front of such a distinguished group of healthcare professionals, and I look forward to the opportunity to both make this presentation to you and perhaps get some feedback from you with regards to questions and comments after the presentation is over. The title of today's presentation is the HVAC system's role in environmental infection control for hospitals. And what I'm going to be talking about specifically is the HVAC system's impact on severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus, or SARS-CoV, and as well the latest strain SARS-CoV-2, which leads to the disease COVID-19. What I'm going to do today is take kind of a 30,000-foot overview of this scenario from an HVAC perspective, simply because we only have an hour today. By all means, feel free to reach out to me at any time for more information or comment. I'm very active on LinkedIn, and if we're not connected, I certainly hope that we will be after today's presentation. What I am going to talk about is where we are, where we're going, and how we might get there. I will not necessarily be discussing such measures as hand washing and social distancing, although following these recommendations may be key in reducing the spread of this disease even further than we have so far. And I will be talking about large droplet and contact transmission, which are still considered the prevalent modes of transmission by most major healthcare organizations. But I'm going to be putting a little twist on that as well. I'm going to be talking about some dynamics that you may not have heard about yet that are very important. So the most current statistics with regards to the coronavirus disease, COVID-19, from both a US and worldwide perspective are listed on the screen. And this has been a sobering experiment for me because I've been giving this presentation now for about 5 or 6 weeks, 3 or 4 times a day, 5 days a week. And every day I go in and update these numbers with the latest statistics. And although I believe we are seeing a flattening of the curve, the delta in numbers day to day are not as great as they were at first. They're still going up, and it's obviously still an issue of major concern from a worldwide perspective. This is the point in the presentation where I like to make the recommendation that we don't go off script with what it is we do. Right? We don't get out the duct tape and the baling wire and start jury rigging systems the way that we've always wanted to do it in the past, just because we have a dilemma that we're faced with. In fact, what we need to do is look at credible agencies, credible resources that put forth credible information for us, the professionals that serve the HVAC environmental aspects of hospital and healthcare facilities, in order to help guide us, just like they always have in the past. And some of those credible agencies would be those such as the CDC, who publishes their guidelines for environmental infection control in healthcare facilities, and of course ASHRAE, the American Society for Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers, that has a plethora of information, including some recent position documents on both airborne infectious diseases, aerosol transmitted infectious diseases, and filtration for hospital facilities that are some great resources to go to and use in our initiatives to create better and healthier environments. Now, those of you that are involved in healthcare hospital HVAC design are probably familiar with ASHRAE Standard 170. It's the ventilation of healthcare facilities. It's considered the backbone or the cornerstone, if you will, of hospital ventilation, minimum codes and standards for those facilities. And it gives us a bunch of information with regards to the ventilation of various spaces within hospital and other healthcare environments. And it takes each of those individual spaces, and based on what it is that that space is assigned to accomplish, it gives us information with regards to the pressure rate relationships of that space to another, whether it's positive or negative, whether it is trying to fight the impact of infection going into that space, or it's trying to make sure that the airflow pressurization is outward from that space in order to protect individuals that are within that environment. It also goes into things like the amount of outside air that's required for ventilation, the number of air changes that are required in that space from a standpoint of actually moving the air through the HVAC system. things such as whether or not the air can be recirculated or whether or not it has to be 100% outside air system. And then it gets into minimum requirements for temperatures and relative humidities and things of that nature. And I strongly recommend that moving forward, you utilize these resources and the information contained within them to help guide you with regards to anything you may want to do within the environments you're responsible for controlling and maintaining. Now I'm going to take a quick step back and just give us a little primer, if you will, on particle physics, because what I'm going to be talking about moving forward are some specific particle sizes, all right? And the reason we're going to be talking about particle sizes is simply because everything in the air, for the most part, is either a particle or a gas, and it's going to have an aerodynamic diameter and weight. And that helps guide us with regards to ventilation rate effectiveness and filtration effectiveness and things of that nature. So we need to know the size of the particular concern that we're dealing with in the airborne environment. So for example, at the top of this slide is a big black round circle that represents a human hair plucked from your head, turned on end, and you're looking down the barrel or the diameter of that human hair. And you can see that that hair is a size somewhere in the area between 100 and 150 micrometers or microns, all right? And it's obviously grossly exaggerated on this slide just so that we can compare it to smaller particles. But that's relatively small in itself. I would have a hard time seeing a hair turned on end. I'm a little bit older, my eyes aren't as good as they used to be. The point is simply this: as we work our way down that scale, based on what the particular particle is, we can see that those particles get smaller and smaller and smaller. So we can see that when we get down into the size range of a typical virus, somewhere between 0.001 to 0.01 microns, we are dealing with extremely small particles that are absolutely invisible to the human eye, and you would need some type of a microscope to be able to see. Now, viruses are extremely small, but you will notice I have encompassed in red the next category immediately above that. And I just want you to keep that in mind. I have highlighted the 0.3 to 1 micron size range. And you can see relative to a human hair, it's still very, very small. But relative to a virus, it's rather large. And the reason that I have highlighted that is simply this, that viruses from an airborne perspective, viruses that have been expelled from a human being via a droplet through a cough or a sneeze, the virus is actually contained in a liquid, and that liquid is larger than the virus itself. In fact, that liquid may contain many viruses based on the shedding rate of the individual and the disease or the virus that we're talking about. So the transport mechanism that allows that virus to move from a host who has expelled it into the airborne environment to a susceptible host who receives it, that particle that conveys the virus is larger than the virus itself. And it's important to understand that when it comes to looking at what we're going to do from a standpoint of helping to filter those particles out of the air. So keep that size range in mind, if you would, please. So what we know right now from a standpoint of the modes of transmission of not only the SARS-CoV-2 virus, but also other airborne transmissible viruses that we've studied in the past, as directed by the agencies such as the World Healthcare Organization and the CDC, what they're telling us is that respiratory infections can be transmitted through droplets of different sizes. And when the droplet particles are larger than 5 to 10 microns in diameter, they are referred to as a respiratory droplet. It's important to keep that in mind. This is what the WHO and the CDC recognizes as the transmission route for these viruses, large respiratory droplets. Now, they do mention that when the droplets are less than 5 microns in diameter, they're referred to as droplet nuclei. They don't tell us much more than that, though. You probably haven't heard much of that being promoted or talked about on the news at night when you're hearing all the social distancing rules that have come forth from these agencies. I'm going to talk in much greater detail about what those droplet nuclei are because they're very important, and I will show you that in slides to come. But understand, this is the WHO model up to this point. And I'm not saying it's wrong. It's absolutely correct. It just leaves some areas for us to fill in and to understand so that we get the entire dynamics of how these viruses are actually transmitted via airborne fashion. Now, according to current evidence, the COVID-19 virus is primarily transmitted between people through respiratory droplets and contact routes, all right? And that, again, is the WHO traditional model for virus transmission. So let's take a look at what that would look like pictorially, all right? Over on the left-hand side of the screen, we have an infected individual. And that infected individual either coughs or sneezes. And based on whether it's a cough or sneeze, and based on the particular diameter, the micron diameter of the particle that has been expelled from that individual, it will do one of three things based on this modeling. Number one, if the particle is large enough, it will settle out onto a surface at a distance of about 1.5 meters or somewhere in the area of 3 to 4 feet. So if it's large enough, it will fall by gravity onto a surface, and then it becomes what's known as a fomite, which means that if you, having expelled it, or someone else comes into the room and touches that surface, and that viral particle is still virulent, it's still infective, and then they touch themselves or they touch someone else, they can transfer that virus via contact. WHO said that's possible, and it certainly is. In addition to that, whether that individual coughs or sneezes, that particular aerosol droplet will be propelled a certain distance in the air. Based on a cough, they're showing that it will be propelled approximately 2 meters or about 6 feet. All right, so if you are within that 6-foot window when someone coughs, it is possible for you to come in contact with that particle that may contain a virus that may infect you. That's where the 6-foot distancing rule comes from, that the WHO and the CDC are promoting and that we're trying to adhere to in our social activities and endeavors of late. They also show that if you sneeze, those larger respiratory droplets may be propelled a distance of approximately 6 meters or about 18 feet. All right, so again, if you're within that window of distance, you may be in contact with that possible infectious virus via airborne transmission. What we do know from studies on other diseases and viruses of these types, other COVIs, is that these distances are a little bit short of what reality is showing from a testing perspective. For example, a sneeze has been shown to travel a distance of up to 30 feet at velocities between 50 and 80 miles per hour. So good luck getting out of the way there, right? So the model's a little bit short, but the point is simply stay out of the way of other people if they're infected, if they're coughing or sneezing based on this modeling. But what about these little particles that they show floating around up close to the individual that's expelled them into the environment? What about these? Well, these are those droplet nuclei, the smaller than 5 micron particles that they defined but didn't go into great definition with regards to what they are or what they do. I'm going to talk a lot about that moving forward because they're very important. So this is the typical chain of communicable disease transmission model, if you will. And we can see up in the upper right-hand corner of this drawing, I have what looks like a chain, and it attaches link to link to link from one end to the other, all right? And then down below, I show that in more or less a pictorial representation. And this is based on information that came out of the International Journal of Oral Sciences for dental applications, where we have an infected patient that comes in and possibly infects a dental professional. But you need to understand, this modeling could hold true for any scenario. It could be a healthcare application, it could be an office, it could be a school. The furnishings within the space might change a little bit, and the listing of the individuals involved might change a little bit, but it's the same chain of communicable diseases regardless. So we're going to go through this real quickly, and I'm going to talk about it because it's important. We'll start up here in the upper right-hand corner with the chain itself. We have what's called a reservoir. The reservoir is represented over in the left-hand side of the drawing towards the bottom. The reservoir in this case is an infected patient. They have a reservoir of infectious disease that they may be capable of transmitting. Now, it's important to understand that reservoirs come in a couple of different flavors, if you will, right? We know that what has been proposed with regards to the current SARS-CoV-2 virus and has been shown and proven with other COVID viruses in the past is that it can originate in an animal. It is then what's called a zoonotic disease, which means it can transfer from an animal to a human, and from a human to a human. And that is what we are expecting to be proven and hold evident with regards to this particular strain of SARS-CoV-2. Regardless, a reservoir is a reservoir, all right? As we work our way around the chain up here at the top, we see we need a route of exit. The route of exit in this example is that infected patient or that reservoir either coughing or sneezing and expelling droplets, which may contain virus, into the ambient environment. We then need a mode of transmission. The mode of transmission at this point is simply, it's airborne. Those particles are in the ambient environment. Something's going to happen next. We need a route of entry. The route of entry would simply be a possible susceptible individual that is close enough to the reservoir when they cough or sneeze that they come in airborne contact with the droplets, with the virus, and inhale them. Or, depending on the weight, the aerodynamic weight and size of the particle itself, it may settle out onto surfaces such as dental equipment, where it then is touch contacted by the dental professional in this example, and they infect themselves that way. And then, of course, we need a route of entry. The route of entry would simply be, am I inhaling it or am I touching it and infecting myself in that method? We need a susceptible host. That takes us over to the right-hand side of this drawing. We have a dental professional who is, in this example, our host, or the lucky reciprocant of that nasty droplet that's been expelled. Now, it's important to understand that susceptible hosts can come in a couple of different flavors as well, right? A susceptible host may be an immunocompromised patient in a hospital environment. Let's say it's someone that's in the hospital and being treated for cancer, right? They're undergoing radiation and their immune system has been depleted drastically. So they are very susceptible to any potential viruses or diseases in the ambient around them. They can easily become infected. Or we may have a host that has immunities to the particular or specific disease of concern. They just don't become infected for one reason or the other. And we may have as well what's called an asymptomatic host, which means they are infected, they are sick, they just don't know it, and they are capable of spreading that disease unknowingly to other people. So those are three of the flavors, and I'm sure there's more. We continue our chain and we connect it at the top with the infectious agent, and that is simply the pathogen of concern that's contained within the droplets that have been expelled from the reservoir. So as long as this chain is intact, and as long as the virus or pathogen contained in these droplets is infectious, right? It's virulent, infection can occur. The whole idea behind social distancing is simply breaking one of the links in the chain so that the transmission of virus from the left-hand side of the drawing, the reservoir, to the right-hand side of the drawing, the susceptible host, cannot occur. So we try to drive a wedge between these two and keep them apart. And that's the whole concept behind social distancing, and it makes sense, and it works. In addition to that, though, the HVAC system and its design has an influence in controlling and disrupting the transmission pathways of infectious aerosol viruses as well, because we can ventilate, we can exhaust, we can filter, we can do things of that nature, which may, in addition, break one of those links in the chain. So that's why it's important to take a look at this from a standpoint of the built environment that you are working and living in, and making sure that the systems that are circulating and filtering air in those environments are up to the capability of that task. So that's kind of where we were up to this point. That's kind of what we've been told by the WHO and the CDC, and it's absolutely right and it makes sense. What I'm going to talk about now is what we are finding out specific to COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2, and what we know about other similar COVID viruses that we have studied in the past, because it's kind of a blend of the two right now that we're working off of to be able to analyze and make recommendations moving forward. It's important to understand that the professionals that are analyzing this particular pandemic scenario are healthcare professionals and scientists and infectious control people, and none of them are going to stick their neck on the block and say something specific about this disease until it's been proven, right? It's important that it's tested and vetted and that we get actual factual information, because trust me, there's enough stuff floating around right now that makes no sense at all. So I applaud them for doing that. But this isn't the time either to sit on our hands. We have to do something. So we do take a look at past testing on other similar viruses and draw a parallel. And I'm going to do a little of both of that moving forward. I'll try to differentiate between the two so that you know which is which. So recent research specifically into COVID-19 has narrowed it to that of transmission by droplet. And in the beginning of this, they wouldn't even say that. They now are. That is why we're hearing from the CDC and the WHO with regards to their recommendations. All right. It's been proven specific to this disease. According to a new study that was done about four or 5 weeks ago now by the National Institutes of Health in conjunction with some other very credible research institutions and printed in the New England Journal of Medicine, they have found that the virus, the specific virus that causes the COVID-19 disease, has been found to be stable for several hours to days in aerosols in the air and on surfaces. We've known that in the past of other COVIs. We are now finding this to be true with regards to SARS-CoV-2. Exactly how long that is, we don't know yet. Testing will prove that. But we do know so far they've found hours to days from a standpoint of that virus being in the environment and possibly being infective. So that is of major concern. In addition, another recent study has pinpointed the size, if you will, of the droplets that I've been talking about that contain the viruses. And they have found aerodynamic dominance between the sizes of 0.25 to 1 microns. Remember the little red box that I told you to keep in your mind? That's why I did that. And other larger supermicron regions, 2.5 microns and above, which we would anticipate. Again, many of those will be the larger droplets that settle out on the surface in a relatively short distance and then can be disinfected or removed from the space through traditional cleaning methodologies. But it's the small ones, the 0.25 to 1 micron size particles, that are going to create havoc on us in the space if we're not aware of it and if we don't do something to help remediate them. And I am going to talk about that right now. So what exactly are those droplets? What are those aerosols that I talk about being expelled from a possibly infectious individual? And particularly, what are these droplet nuclei, the really small particles that I mentioned? Well, here's what they are. If we take a look down in the lower portion of this slide, we see an infectious individual on the right-hand side of the slide, coughing or sneezing. You can see the particulate, you can see the droplets being expelled from that individual via airborne transmission to a possible susceptible host on the left-hand side of the chart. And that is exactly the WHO model that has been talked about and that we just went through a slide or two ago. All right. What those droplets consist of are liquids, typically mucus and saliva, and they may come from deep within the respiratory system, right? So we cough those up, we sneeze those up, and we expel them to the environment. What's inside of those can be various viruses, and it can be multiple viruses based on the shedding rate, which we do not yet know for SARS-CoV-2. And it can also include things like bacteria, volatile compounds. It's basically a cesspool of possible infectious pathogens that we expel from our bodies on somewhat of a regular basis. What happens when they are expelled from us into the ambient environment is that they will immediately in a split second begin to evaporate. That's because they're liquid, and what they want to do is seek an equilibrium with the moisture that's in the air that surrounds it. So if the air is dry, that particle will come out, immediately desiccate or evaporate to a smaller size. Then based on, again, the relative humidity of the space, it can desiccate even further in ratios of as much as 50 to 1, and it can do it very quick. I'll show you in the next slide just how quickly that can occur. But the point is simply this: just because it has evaporated or desiccated does not mean that it is still not infectious. In fact, the smaller particles can actually be more infectious, more ferocious than the larger particles, because in addition to all the stuff that I mentioned here that they contain, and in addition to being liquid, they also contain salts that encase the viruses. And those salts create kind of a dielectric, if you will, between the virus and the environment. But when you dry the particle out, the salts desiccate and it's easier for that virus to break itself free, if you will, and attach itself to the cells of a susceptible host and make that host infected with the specific virus itself. So it is of great concern in the airborne environment. The other problem is that it can become incredibly small very fast, and it can remain in the airborne environment almost indefinitely. Here's an example of a 100 micron size particle, the size of a diameter of a human hair, that's expelled, and this happens to be based on water, but we consider it to be typical of the aerosol particles that I mentioned being expelled from a human being. And we can see that within about 10 seconds, there is a several order of magnitude difference in the size that it came out and the size it ends up at. It becomes very small in a relatively short amount of time, 10 seconds or so, right? But on smaller particles that have been expelled, say in the 1 micron size range, we can see that within 0.001 seconds, we'll see an order of magnitude difference in its size. In a split second, it's reduced 10 times in size. And at that diameter, that 0.1 micron diameter and thereabouts, it can remain in the environment indefinitely. All right, here's an example of particles settling in still air. This would be a room that contains perfectly still air. And if we were to take a 100 micron particle size over here on the right-hand side, again, that's a particle representative of the diameter of a human hair, and we were to drop it from a distance of 5 feet to the floor, it would take about 6 seconds for it to settle. As we work our way down the chart and we get smaller and smaller and smaller, take a look at the 0.5 micron size particle. It would take 41 hours to settle in that perfectly still environment, a short distance of 5 feet. Now remember, I mentioned that they have found aerosol particles containing the virus as small as 0.25 microns, which is very small in comparison. So these hours of settling time would be extended drastically for those smaller particles. In addition, this is considering a room with perfectly still air. And there are no rooms I know of in the built environment that are perfectly still. Let's take a hospital room, for example, right? You've got a patient in the room. They're moving around, they're rolling in the bed, they're getting up and going to the restroom, whatever the case might be. You've got healthcare professionals coming in and out of the space, creating air currents on a regular basis, maybe dragging things with them as they leave. You have an HVAC system that, for example, may be pushing air into or pulling air out of the space. All of that is creating relatively considerable turbulence within that space. And the point is simply this: as the turbulence is increased, these settling times become extended exponentially. I read a study a couple of years ago that was done in Sweden, and they went into a typical office environment, and they wanted to do DNA particle sampling to see how long some of the particles had actually remained in that ambient environment. And they actually found particles through DNA testing that had been in the environment from someone that had not been in that building for over 20 years. Now we're talking really, really small particles. But what that indicates is that those really small particles can remain in the environment almost forever, right? Now, I am not suggesting that if that had been a droplet nuclei that had been desiccated and had a living virus, a pathogenic infectious virus in it, that it would still be viable 20 years later. That's probably not the case. But it could have been viable for hours or days or longer. Considering it had been in the environment for 20 years, it's still not something that we want to breathe, right? That is not good for us to be breathing those very, very, very small particles into our lungs. So it simply is representative of the fact that these droplet nuclei that have not necessarily been discussed up to this point are a very important consideration for us to be aware of when it comes to helping curb viral disease transmission in the airborne environment within buildings. So that's where we were, and this is a little bit more about where we are now, all right? So this was a study that was done about 4 weeks ago. At the time, it was cutting edge, and it was done by the University of Nebraska Medical Center in conjunction with, again, some other very credible research agencies. And they found through their testing that their data suggested that the viral aerosol particles that are produced by individuals that have COVID-19 disease can be transmitted into the environment in the absence of a cough or sneeze, which simply means all you have to do is be talking are breathing and you are still emitting these aerosols into the environment. Well, that's nothing new with regards to other viruses that we have studied in the past. We knew that to be the case. I could have told you that would be the case. But the point is simply this: we are finding some very similar parallels between past research and current research into this specific strain of the virus. It's good to know. We can now state it with certainty. They also found genetic material from the virus specific to SARS-CoV-2 in air samples from both inside and outside of confirmed patients' rooms. This, at that time, offered limited evidence that some potential for airborne transmission existed. We knew this in the past. We are now finding it to be true with regards to SARS-CoV-2. And more studies are coming forth to promote this concept with greater certainty. Now, they took samples from 11 patients' rooms that were confirmed with the COVID-19 disease, and they found viral genetic material on commonly used surfaces that you would expect to find them on, the large particles that settle out almost immediately, bed linens, handrails on the beds, on the floor, on the table, in the bathroom, on the faucets, on the toilet. But they also found it in the air outside of the patient's room, as well as inside, of course, and on surfaces. They found the viral material on surfaces outside the patient's rooms on the return air grills to the HVAC system, leading back to the units that feed the rest of the hospital. Now, I do not believe they popped the grills off and went into the ductwork to see if the material had been transmitted any further than the return air grills, but we've done studies in the past with other viruses that indicates that's very possible and does occur. So we may find that to be the facts as well with regards to SARS-CoV-2 once the testing is completed and we get the documented research and results into our hands. I would expect that to be the case. Now, here's an example of this kind of reverts back to that WHO modeling, if you will, but it makes some valid points on how aerosol diseases, airborne aerosol diseases infect us as human beings and how our built-in defense mechanisms can actually help us. We have an individual on the right-hand side that is infected with something. He is our source, if you will. Whoops, I'm sorry. He's coughing or sneezing. He's emitting droplet aerosols in the size range of about 10 microns based on this example into the environment in close proximity of a possible susceptible host on the left-hand side that comes in contact and inhales those aerosols. Now, based on the size of the particle, a couple of different things will happen, right? The larger particles will actually settle out in our upper respiratory tract. We have a mucus lining and we have ciliary hair, and that actually acts as a flypaper and a filter to kind of extract or hold the large particles in our upper respiratory tract until we swallow. They then go into our gut, are digested, and we know from there where they go. Now, studies have shown, specific to SARS-CoV-2 as well as other COVID viruses, that may not be the end of the story. They can be retransmitted when you flush the toilet. The agitation of the flush will actually re-inject possible viral material into the ambient. And if you're there to receive it, it then becomes what's called fecal oral transmission. And I don't need to go into great detail, I don't think, about what that is. The point is simply this: close the toilet lid if you're infected before you flush the toilet, all right? Now, in addition to that, there's all those small particles that we know are there, the ones that have maybe started larger and desiccated and become very small and remain in the environment indefinitely. What happens with those? Well, those have the ability to work their way deep into our respiratory system, deep into our lungs. And that is how we get a respiratory or a deep respiratory infection, right? In addition to that, some of those particles may be so small that they can actually cross the membrane lining between the lung and our bloodstream. And then we then get what is known as a bloodborne infection, or we become sepsis. And with immunocompromised patients in healthcare environments, this is a very dire situation to be in. It's hard to treat. It's easy for them to become infected because they are immunocompromised. And the mortality rate on that is very high. So that's not something that we want to have occurring in healthcare scenarios with these types of patients, nor in any other environment. The point is simply this: the small particles matter. They're the ones that can really do the damage to us from a standpoint of making us ill and keeping us ill, and maybe making us iller than we would have or could have, should have been, had they been filtered out of the air and been removed. So what do we do moving forward, right? We know we have issues. We've known it in the past. We are now finding it to hold exactly true with regards to the current strain of this virus. We need to do something moving forward. Well, we have known for years and years that relative humidity in the environment plays a profound effect on our health and well-being. On the left-hand side, I show a chart that has been available through ASHRAE since the 1980s that indicates, based on the issues of concern on the left-hand side here, the optimum zone for relative humidity within the environment that helps diminish the concerns or issues with these items over here. So we can see that the optimum range is considered to be somewhere between 30 and 60% relative humidity, right? And if we vary out of that range, either drier or wetter, for lack of a better term, we can see that the possibility of those issues increase, right? Particularly with regards to low relative humidities. There are certain issues concerning that I'll go into detail here in a slide or two, but I will say that more current research specific to respiratory viruses have tightened that range a little bit to a window of 40 to 60%. And it tells us that if we vary outside of this range, either higher or lower, it has a profound impact on that respiratory virus's viability, or its effectiveness, and also its decay rate, or its length of life. Particularly with regards to lower relative humidities, in addition to having a more infective and a longer living virus, because the relative humidity in the space is lower, that particle that's been expelled can desiccate or evaporate deeper and become smaller. And when it becomes smaller, it remains in the environment longer. If we can keep the particle humidified, if you will, we can keep its diameter and weight larger, not allow it to evaporate, it may have a chance to settle out onto surfaces where we can come in and clean those surfaces. So that goes a long way to help keep the airborne environment healthier for us. So relative humidity is a big deal. We need to be looking at that. And we've known that for a long time. In addition to that, it has an impact just on our comfort. Number one, I'm in Colorado and it gets really dry here in the wintertime. My eyes are always itching. My throat is always dry. I run my humidifier all the time in my apartment, and I can't keep the relative humidity up above 20% in the dead of winter. That's not a conducive environment for comfort or for well-being, because the mucous membrane and the cilia that I talked about become more viscous, and my built-in filter for extracting some of those larger particles is impaired. So I can become sicker easier, and that's the way it works. So relative humidity is a big deal. We've known that. We need to start implementing it again in buildings moving forward. And this last slide, or this slide in particular, I'm going to point simply to the last bullet point, and that is that the estimated cost in the United States yearly for the common cold is about 40 billion per year, and over 87 billion per year for influenza. That's the impact it has on our economy on a reoccurring seasonal basis, because these are reoccurring and seasonal diseases that we struggle with every year. Major financial impact. Now, I have no idea what we will see the price tag end up being for our current situation with COVID-19. It will be trillions and trillions, probably just to us in the US alone. And I can't imagine how many hundreds of trillions it will be, or more, excuse me, or more from a worldwide perspective. There is some suggestion that COVID-19 may be a reoccurring disease or a seasonal disease similar to the two that I just mentioned. Now, hopefully, if it does reoccur seasonally, by then, the next time, we'll have a vaccine available that will help flatten the curve. But the point is, it's had a major impact financially. It may have a major impact financially as well moving forward. So when it comes to a building owner asking a design professional such as myself, what does it cost to better provide HVAC equipment, or to provide better HVAC systems and equipment that can help create healthier environments? The answer is simply It's not what it costs to do it, it's what it costs not to do it. We have to start addressing these issues moving forward better than we have in the past. So some things we can do, and I'll go over this very quickly. I won't go into great detail on any of these, but one thing we might look at doing is just increasing or upping the efficiency of the filtration that we have built into our HVAC systems today. If we have an existing system that has, for example, what's called a MERV 8 filter, we might want to upgrade that to a MERV 11 filter. Or if we have a MERV 11 filter, we might want to upgrade it to a MERV 14. The higher the MERV rating, the more efficient the filter is at extracting some of the smaller particles from the airstream. Now, there's caveats to that. It's not just as simple as pulling one filter out, putting a higher efficiency filter in. You got to look at some things before you do that, because for every action, there's an opposite equal reaction, and it can have an impact on, to create more resistance, the airflow might drop down, and you're bringing in less outdoor air, and you're having less air exchanges, and that can have a negative impact on the environment. So I offset my good deed with a implication on the other side of it. So we need to take it all into consideration when we make these changes and these upgrades. But it's definitely something to consider and can be very cost effective if done right. In addition to that, there are what's called UVGI or ultraviolet germicidal products that can be installed in the HVAC system, in the ductwork of the HVAC system, in the room itself. And any of you in healthcare environments that are working in hospitals may see those little UVGI robots that are brought into an operating room after the surgery is done and after everybody's left the space. And they're allowed to wander around in there for about 30 minutes and impart UVC spectrum light waves to surfaces to help disinfect them. So that can be done right, that can be very effective in helping to reduce or eliminate the spread of certain infectious diseases, both airborne and fomite transmitted or surface transmitted. There is a technology out there right now which is showing incredible promise. It's bipolar air ionization. And more specifically, there's one product out there that is needlepoint bipolar air ionization, and that just has to do with how the ions are made. Won't mean anything to you for the most part, but I like this kind of stuff. This is a big deal to me. And the beauty of this product is simply this. It can do what UVGI does from a standpoint of helping keep air handling surfaces internally clean of biological growth like mold and mildew on cooling coils. But it can also agglomerate particles in the space. The ions are allowed to be extended into the space, which they can be through the ductwork. And they can go into the space and agglomerate the small particles through electrical attraction. So these ions are both positive and negative in charge. And when they come in contact with a particle in the space that is oppositely charged, it will attract it, and it will attract others. And those particles then will become bigger and easier to move from the space and easier for the filters to pull out of the airstream. So there's some obvious benefits there. As well, it can kill living pathogens such as mold spores, and it can disrupt the DNA or the RNA of a virus and leave it incapable of being infected based on the virus, right? So it's showing some promise, and something that you may want to just keep in mind. But the bottom line is simply this: when it comes to HVAC technologies that can claim positively to kill the COVID-19 disease, there are none that I know of. And it's simply because the virus has not been around long enough to be tested, right? It's going to take a long time for this virus or its surrogate to get into the laboratories and be tested based on manufacturers' equipment, right? Doesn't mean that there's not equipment out there that can do the job. It just means if someone is coming to you right now, to the best of my knowledge, and telling you that they have something that can for sure be effective killing COVID-19, I'd be skeptical, right? Now, understanding that and understanding that it may take more than a year to get these claims tested, verified, and into our hands, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has enacted what they call a hierarchy-based policy. And that means if a company's product has been found to be effective against harder to kill viruses, it's likely to kill a virus like COVID-19. We need some guidance. We've got to move forward. This is their guidance. So those products that are likely to have the greatest protection to you from COVID-19 will have efficacy claims against at least one non-enveloped virus. Norovirus, poliovirus, the list goes on and on. I'm sure you know them better than I do, right? Those are non-enveloped viruses. Those are harder to kill than enveloped viruses, and COVIs are enveloped viruses. So this is our best practice at this point. Unless we have a time machine and we move forward and we see what transpires and we come back and apply that, which we can't do, we've got to have a methodology moving forward to help create better environments, particularly right now when people are going back into the workplace and they're reoccupying buildings, and there's still a major concern with regards to the transmission of this disease and others, because it has been brought to our attention now. It's a big deal, right? So that's what we've been told to do, and that's the best practice that has been recommended to us by the EPA. Now, obviously, once we have products that are available with evidence-based testing results, and our options will be clearer, we'll know exactly what to do. But until then, this is credible guidance. So my closing thoughts are simply this. The WHO model for the modes of transmission that I showed you, specific to SARS-CoV-2, are correct, but they need to be expanded to include the things they haven't really talked about, things such as those droplet nuclei, right, which can remain in the environment and remain infective for an indefinite period of time. We know that the airborne transmissible disease and its infectivity can be emitted to the environment in more than just a cough or sneeze. It can simply be talking or breathing. It's important to understand that. The SARS-CoV-2 virus is being proven to be transmittable via droplet nuclei, the small ones, over long distances within the built environment. We knew that of other viruses in the past. This is just coming to fruition now, and I can see the writing on the wall. It's going to very closely parallel what we've known in the past. The proper environmental relative humidity is a great way to protect building occupants from transmissible pathogens and make healthier, more comfortable indoor environments. If you're in a hospital environment where they have humidifiers, but they've turned them off because they are a maintenance headache sometimes, see about getting those turned back on, or see about getting someone in there that can look at the system and get it to operate the way it should. Relative humidity is a big deal, right? And we know as well that there are no HVAC products right now that can claim to kill COVID-19 with 100% certainty. But there are recommendations out there that do allow us to move forward. And we do need to do that. We need to move forward. We need to protect ourselves and others within healthcare environments and other built environments as well. And implementing and upgrading HVAC systems to include things like improved ventilation, improved filtration, proper humidification, and some of the advanced IEQ technologies that I talked about that can be bundled with ventilation filtration might be a great way, a wonderful step in the right direction of helping to create buildings that are better, that allow us to possibly remain occupied in those buildings throughout future pandemic issues like this that most certainly will occur. So with that, I will again say thank you. It's been a wonderful opportunity for me to have the pleasure to speak with you. And should you have any questions, I'll open it up right now for those.